So we're diving into predictive processing today. And you've been exploring this idea for a bit, right? It has some pretty wild implications for how we experience, well, everything, really, even ourselves.
It really does. And it gets to some really fundamental questions about how our brains work. Like, we tend to think of our brains as, just reacting to the world, but predictive processing suggests something much more active is going on.
Okay, so instead of just reacting, what's it doing?
Predicting. It's like our brains are constantly generating these expectations, kind of like, almost like they're trying to guess what's going to happen next.
Master guessers. I like that. So give me an example. How does that actually play out in, everyday life?
Well, think about something like listening to a familiar song, right? You might find yourself anticipating the next note, the next chord, or when you throw a ball, you instinctively predict where it's going to land. Predictive processing suggests our brains are doing this all the time, but on a much grander scale.
The song is our whole sensory experience, basically.
Exactly. Our brains are constantly drawing on past experiences, trying to anticipate what's coming next in the symphony of our senses.
And I imagine it doesn't always get it right, those predictions, right?
Of course not. And that's where the really interesting stuff happens. You see, any mismatch between our predictions and what actually happens, that's called prediction error. And our brains don't like prediction error.
Who does? Right. So how does the brain deal with that?
Well, it tries to minimize it. That prediction error acts as a signal, basically telling the brain, hey, your model of the world is a bit off. Time to adjust.
Okay, so it's a constant process of updating and fine-tuning an instrument. But how does it actually do that? How does the brain take in new information and update its beliefs?
Well, there's this mathematical framework called Bayes' theorem. Now, we don't have to get into the nitty-gritty math here.
No, spare me.
But basically, it describes how we update our beliefs in light of new evidence.
Okay, I think I get the general idea, but can you give me a concrete example? How does Bayes' theorem work in practice?
All right, picture this. You wake up, you're totally convinced it's going to be a sunny day, but then you glance out the window and boom, dark, ominous clouds are rolling in. Your brain, using something akin to Bayes' theorem, takes that new visual information, weighs it against your initial sunny prediction, and bam, updates your belief. You might still be hoping for some sunshine, but you're probably grabbing an umbrella just in case, right? That's your brain doing Bayesian updating in action.
Fascinating. So our brain is constantly weighing what it already knows against what it's currently experiencing.
Precisely. It's like it's always trying to find the most probable explanation for what's going on based on the information it has.
Got it. So is this process, this Bayesian updating, happening everywhere in the brain? Or are there specific areas that are more involved in making these predictions?
That's a great question. And it leads us to another important concept in predictive processing: hierarchical generative models.
Okay, let's unpack that. What are hierarchical generative models?
Basically, the idea is that the brain is structured in a hierarchical way, kind of like imagine a company's organizational chart. You have different levels, each handling different levels of processing and prediction.
Intriguing. So different departments with different roles, but all working together.
Exactly. At the lower levels, you have areas that are dealing with the raw sensory data, the sights, sounds, smells, and so on. Then as you move up the hierarchy, you have areas that are processing more complex, abstract information.
Okay, so if I see a dog running towards me.
Right. The lower levels of your brain are processing the basic visual information, the movement, the shape, maybe even the sound of its bark.
And then the higher levels.
They're putting all that information together, drawing on your past experiences to recognize, hey, that's not just any four-legged creature, that's a golden retriever.
Wow, so it's like building a puzzle, starting with those individual pieces of sensory data and then working our way up to a complete picture.
Exactly. And this hierarchical structure is what allows us to make sense of incredibly complex information, from something as seemingly simple as recognizing a friend's face to something as nuanced as understanding a conversation.
So our brains are like expert puzzle solvers, taking these tiny bits of sensory information and constructing a coherent picture of the world around us.
Exactly. And that puzzle solving is all about minimizing surprises, right?
Yeah.
That's where this concept of free energy comes in.
Yeah, that's a term that always throws me off a bit. It sounds kind of, I don't know, mystical almost.
It does have a certain ring to it, doesn't it? But in the context of predictive processing, free energy is very much grounded in this idea of surprise and uncertainty. Essentially, our brains are wired to minimize this free energy.
Okay, so the less surprised our brains are, the less free energy there is.
Yeah, got it. Fewer prediction errors equal less free energy. And in a way, you could say that equates to our brains being in a more, well, comfortable state.
It's like our brains are striving for a sense of calm, a sense of order. They want to know what's coming next.
Exactly. And what's even more fascinating is this drive towards minimizing surprise, this push for order and predictability. It might be fundamental to how life itself persists.
Whoa, okay, now you're getting really big picture. So you're saying this isn't just about how our brains work, it's about the very nature of life itself.
Exactly. Think about it. Life, in a very fundamental sense, is about constantly adapting, evolving, learning to anticipate and respond to the environment in a way that, well, ensures survival.
So predicting accurately is essential in this view for survival.
Right. And this actually leads us to a really crucial point about predictive processing. It's not just about passive perception, about us just sitting back and interpreting the world around us. It also plays a huge role in shaping our actions, in guiding how we move and interact with our environment.
So you're saying it's not just about how we understand the world, but also about how we act in the world.
Exactly. This is where active inference comes in.
Okay, let's dive into that. What is active inference?
Well, the basic idea is that every action we take, from something as simple as, reaching for a cup of coffee to something as complex as navigating a crowded street, involves a prediction about the sensory feedback we expect to receive.
Okay, so walk me through that. How does that work with, say, the cup of coffee example?
Sure. So you decide you want to sip a coffee. Your brain generates a prediction of what that experience will be like. The feeling of the cup in your hand, the sensation of the warm liquid, and so on.
Our brains are generating these mini movies of the future, basically.
That's a great way to put it. And then here's the key. Our movements are orchestrated to fulfill those predictions, to make those sensory expectations match up with reality.
It's like our brains are constantly running simulations, testing out different actions and their predicted outcomes before we even lift a finger.
Exactly. And this becomes even clearer when we look at certain illusions that really highlight just how powerful these predictive mechanisms are.
Oh, like what? Give me an example.
Have you ever heard of the disappearing hand trick?
It sounds vaguely familiar. Refresh my memory.
So in this illusion, a person's hand is hidden from view, maybe it's behind a screen or something, and a fake hand, like a realistic-looking rubber hand, is placed in front of them.
Okay, I'm picturing it. So I can see the fake hand, but not my real hand.
Right. Then both the real hidden hand and the fake hand are simultaneously stroked with a brush. Kind of the same way.
Okay, so I'm feeling the stroking on my real hand, but I'm seeing it happening to the fake hand.
Exactly. And here's the thing. Because the brain is receiving visual input, suggesting that the fake hand is their own, and tactile input, the feeling of being stroked, that aligns with that prediction.
It starts to believe the fake hand is the real one.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
The brain starts to incorporate the fake hand into its body schema, into its model of itself.
Wow, that's wild. So even though consciously it's not your real hand, the brain's predictions are so strong that they can override that knowledge.
It's a powerful demonstration of how much of our experience is shaped by these top-down predictions.
So if our brains can be tricked like that, even about something as fundamental as our own bodies, it makes you wonder, what does that mean for how we experience reality in general?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it leads us to another fascinating area where predictive processing has some really intriguing implications. Consciousness itself.
Yeah. So we've been talking about how our brains might be constructing our experience of reality to some extent, right? But then that begs the question, what about consciousness? Where does that fit into all of this?
It's a huge question. And it's one that researchers are still trying to figure out. But predictive processing actually offers some really interesting avenues for exploring consciousness.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How so?
Well, think about it this way. If our brains are constantly generating these predictions, these models of the yield, you could almost say that our experience of reality is a kind of controlled hallucination.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean. We're not just passively observing the world. Our brains are actively constructing our perception of it.
Exactly. So then the question becomes, what makes that constructed experience feel real, feel like consciousness? And what happens when those predictions go a bit off kilter, like when we dream?
Right, because in dreams, our brains are clearly generating all sorts of bizarre scenarios, stuff that would never happen in waking life.
Exactly. It's like our brains are taking a break from the constraints of reality, letting those predictive models run wild. But even in those more unconstrained states, there's still a sense of experience, of consciousness happening, right?
So how do we make sense of that? If consciousness is happening even when our predictions aren't tethered to reality, what does that tell us about how it works?
Well, one idea that's been explored alongside predictive processing is something called integrated information theory, or IIT.
Integrated information theory. Okay, break that down for me. What's that all about?
In a nutshell, IIT proposes that consciousness arises from the way information is integrated within a system, like the brain. The more interconnected and interdependent the information, the richer the conscious experience.
So it's not just about the amount of information, but the complexity of how it's all woven together.
Precisely. It's like, imagine a tapestry. A simple tapestry with just a few colors and a basic design, that might represent a low level of consciousness. But a tapestry with intricate patterns, vibrant colors, all interwoven in complex ways, that represent a much higher level of consciousness.
That's a great analogy. So where does predictive processing fit into all of this? How do these two theories work together?
We'll think about those predictions our brains are constantly generating, right? Those predictions are weaving together all sorts of information sensory data, past experiences, expectations. And IIT suggests that it's the intricate way those predictions are woven together, how they relate to and inform each other, that gives rise to our conscious experience.
Wow, that's pretty mind-blowing. So it's not just that we're predicting, it's the incredibly complex web of predictions that creates the feeling of being conscious.
That's the idea. And it really highlights just how incredible our brains are, constantly processing information, making predictions, weaving together the tapestry of our conscious experience.
So we've gone from predicting the next note in a song to pondering the very fabric of consciousness. But there's one more big question I want to touch on before we wrap up. And it's about the self. If our brains are constructing our reality to a certain extent, does that mean they're also constructing our sense of self? Like, is there a me that exists independently of all these predictions?
The age-old question of the self. It's a big one. But predictive processing does offer some interesting insights here as well. Think about it, right? Our sense of self, who we believe we are, is built upon a lifetime of experiences, memories, actions, all those things that contribute to our sense of identity.
And all of those experiences are being filtered through these predictive mechanisms we've been discussing, right?
Exactly. So just as our brains develop a model of the outside world, they also develop a self model.
A self model. What does that mean exactly?
It's basically a set of predictions about how we will behave, think, and feel in different situations. Like, based on your past experiences, your brain might predict that you're someone who loves trying new foods or someone who gets easily embarrassed in social situations.
So our self is kind of like a prediction too, constantly being updated and refined based on our experiences.
That's one way to think about it. And it really highlights the dynamic and evolving nature of the self. We're not these static, unchanging entities, but rather constantly adapting, changing, rewriting our own story based on the predictions our brains generate.
Wow, this has been quite a journey. We've covered a lot of ground, from the basics of predictive processing to some seriously mind-bending implications for consciousness and the self. So as we wrap things up, what are some key takeaways you hope listeners will walk away with today?
I think the biggest one is this shift from seeing the brain as a passive receiver to an active predictor. We're not just sponges soaking up information. Our brains are actively making sense of the world, constantly generating expectations and testing those expectations against reality.
It's a much more dynamic and honestly a more empowering way to think about how our brains work.
It really is. And while there's still so much we don't know about the brain and how it creates our experience of reality, predictive processing gives us a powerful new lens for understanding everything from perception and action to consciousness and even the self.
It certainly gives you a lot to ponder. So to our listeners, keep those brains predicting, keep asking those big questions, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive.